Thank you, and it is a real delight to have Steve Clemons back. Given the weather in Washington over the weekend, it's a delight to have Steve Clemons here. We were scrambling for a plan B in case he couldn't get out of D.C., but the good news was that he wasn't in D.C. And apologies to anyone who was inconvenienced by the schedule change. Steve was scheduled to come back to us last week, and then he apologetically said he was going to go with Mr. Biden to Davos and Istanbul and other places, and would it be okay if he delayed? And I allowed us how you'd probably let him do that as long as he brought back some good gossip, which he does. Steve Clemons, for those of you who don't know him, is editor-in-chief at The Atlantic, Washington editor-at-large, I should say, at The Atlantic. He's a senior fellow at the American Strategy Program in the New America Foundation, which he founded, with which he still has an association. He has a blog, WashingtonNote.com, which he tells me is going to come back alive, because when you're working 20 hours a week, you don't get a chance to do that very much. What's that? 20 hours a week. No, 20 hours a day. What did I say? Yeah, sorry. The biggest thing to know about Steve is that he is probably one of the most respected people I know. I usually say both sides of the aisle, but I think there are many sides, so I'm just going to say all sides of the aisle. He'll tell you about his relationship with Donald Trump, and I don't think Donald's in any aisle, is he? He was advisor to Senator Jeff Bingaman once upon a time, Democrat from New Mexico. He was the first executive director of the Nixon Center. So he has a long and one of the most extensive networks in American politics as an observer of American foreign policy as well as domestic politics. If I talked to you about the people he knows, we would be here all day and we wouldn't hear from Steve. So without any further ado, it is my great pleasure to bring back to this podium my good friend, Steve Clemons.
Greetings, everybody. I'm normally a coat and tie guy here, but my bags are somewhere in United Airlines' hands, so I tried to spiff up as well as I could here. It's a real pleasure. Skyforcer and Janet are old friends. I knew them in Pittsburgh, and I sort of got addicted to the World Affairs Council circuit and just really value going all over the United States and meeting people for whom what America is doing internationally and what is being done to us internationally matters. And I was so impressed with the Pittsburgh operation, and subsequently am so impressed with the Colorado Springs operation, which I'm no longer dependent on Sky to make that. I'm so happy with Karen and all of you that are doing this. I mentioned to the folks from Wells Fargo that I remembered when I was here a few years ago, not only their sponsorship of the program, but the real commitment to getting younger people here, cadets, students. I see some young people here in the back and throughout the room, and that's so important. So thank you for having me. There's a lot on the agenda lately, and we can take it lots of different directions. I did just get off a plane. I spent the last week with Vice President Biden on Air Force 2. We had, I was in sort of on the edges, like Forrest Gump, of a lot of bilateral meetings. We had sessions with, in Turkey. We were in Istanbul and met President Erdogan and Prime Minister Davutoglu. Happy to talk about that. And in Davos, we were exposed to bilateral moments and engagements with the, heads of government in Cyprus, Ukraine, Israel, Argentina, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan. So a lot, not all the hot spots of the world, but a lot of the hot spots. And then I was in the Intercontinental Hotel in Davos, Switzerland, of course, where the World Economic Forum is, and I saw Javad Zarif, Iran's foreign minister, walk through the lobby. I reminded him that we knew each other from New York when he was ambassador there. We hung out, and then I saw Bibi Netanyahu walk by, and I tweeted that, and I said all seemed to be calm. Now, if the Saudis had been there, I'm not sure how that would have gone, but it was a very interesting moment, and I wish I had, I'm famous for selfies. I wish I'd been able to take a picture with Zarif and Netanyahu in it. It would have been, it would have gone viral. I do, in the kinds of conversations I have, try my best to share, these are my views, but objective views, and because I played around in both the Republican tent and the Democratic tent, not because I cared, but I like everyone to sort of, converse and have engagement. I did have this interesting moment, well, it was more than a moment, a long string of moments with Donald Trump at the White House Correspondents' Dinner last year, where he hugged me and he grabbed me and he said, "Hey, Steve," I was apparently one of the MSNBC guys he watched, and he then proceeded and said, "Let me teach you who really runs America." And he dragged me through the floor, introducing me to sports figures, none of whom I knew, but the guy who caught the Super Bowl pass. So I know about sumo in Japan. That's the only sport I know anything about. I don't follow back. I know you guys just I heard Denver just won something. Congrats. Not sure what it is. I flew in yesterday. The whole plane was electrified. And I said, good for you. But are any of them Yokozuna? But let's talk a little bit seriously about some things going on. And I promise not to leave you in a depressed state after this. We've got dessert. I hear dessert's good. But I want to talk a little bit about America's place in the world and the fact that we're in a presidential season. And so it raises the questions of what comes next. And what is the environment in which the next president of the United States, and frankly the next Congress, and all of the people and players, and even the media that are engaged in sort of shaping and sculpting what the world looks like. What are the opportunities? What are the constraints? What are the real problems? And I think, even though I think I said this 3 years ago when I was here, the world has just gotten messier since then. Despite my best efforts with all of you, you didn't make it better. And it has become a very messy situation in which there are lots of hard choices. And also, to be honest, and I don't know how many of you are into this, and I'm sure you have your own perspectives, it's not often that a president or even a candidate for president is honest and truthful with the electorate about those hard choices out there. There's a lot of posturing. There's a lot of creation of motifs about American power in the world, what can shape, without the kind of detail or without the recognition of some of the hard circumstances that are out there that are really eroding. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit. I remember telling some of you a story, but I think it really holds now, that one time I met the premier of China in Washington, D.C., Hu Jintao, and then I went over as a guest and met Hu Jintao, and I also had an opportunity to meet Xi Jinping, the current head of China, before he ascended. And in that trip, I was able to meet with people I sort of hung out with. I'm a foreign policy wonk, and I wanted to meet the policy planning crowd. These are usually the boring wonks within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China. So I got into the deep bowels of the Chinese government, and it was really cool. And so I asked him, I said, "You brought me in here, now tell me what your grand strategy in the world is. We all really want to know what China is going to do." And he says, "Our grand strategy is to do everything we can to keep America distracted in small Middle Eastern countries." And that was a few years ago, but while it was meant as a joke, there's an element of seriousness about it, and it's important to kind of keep in mind when we look at the headlines of what's happening in the world, what's happening with ISIS, what's happening with Syria, what's happening in Afghanistan. Was it right to take troops out of Iraq or leave them there? That there are also other big issues in the world. Where is economic growth going to happen? What is China doing in the South China Sea? Where is Japan, which is still a Goliath in the global economy and in all of this? There are lots of questions out there and lots of diplomacy that's important, but we have a tendency in this country right now to collectively play a whack-a-mole game. Whack-a-mole means let's chase the mole over here, let's chase the rabbit over here, let's go over here. Very, very reactive. And to a certain degree, what's been popping up in the Middle East, it's easy to say America, and I'm happy to get into it because I've had a couple of robust, I don't want to call them arguments, robust, robust differences of opinion with David Petraeus over the magical moment he thought that engagement in Syria at some point might make a difference. We're happy to talk about that. I've had some real feisty moments with the general. Great leader, but wrong on Syria. We'll just put it there. But anyway, when you look at the whack-a-mole problem and you think about American power in the world, one of the things is America is the most powerful country in the world, but it's almost power without purpose. You have incredible capacity. Though many of you are in the Air Force, many of you have been diplomats, you know that America can project power around the world better than any other nation. It has intelligence capacities which are truly staggering, and Edward Snowden helped us see more than we even knew. Whether you like it or not, that when you look at what Snowden showed we were doing, even though we thought we were big in intelligence before, we're much bigger, to kind of paraphrase Donald Trump, bigger, better, and in that capacity of what we have, what I see happening, and it's a point of concern of mine, is that American power, that apparatus which sprawls around the world, is more hijackable by events and players here and there. And it is that a group, a country, a nation, a cause being able to hijack temporarily a lot of that capacity doesn't translate into power. That translates into distraction, it translates into confusion, it translates into a sense that America can't collectively deliver in the way it used to before. And this is my big concern, that American grand strategy today in the world is something that I think very few people can define. It's very, very hard to figure out what purpose the United States has in the world right now. Right now, a lot of people would like to define American power about ISIS. Others would like to define it as deterring or dealing with Russia and some of Russia's misbehavior. Some are worried about China, but there's not a grand comprehensive picture at this moment, and I think that leaves the United States vulnerable to being used in this whack-a-mole situation. Another interesting thing about the point where we're at historically is part of the American game plan was to help other nations rise, help other nations get rich, get them to buy our products. We would sell them things, we would buy things from them. That America and American workers essentially were going to benefit because America was the world's global guarantor of security. And as a result, America would get slightly better deals economically. That equation has largely come apart. America continues to be an ultimate and the largest guarantor of stability and security in the world, but it's not translating into the economic benefits. There's a detachment of those, and that's why when you look at what's fueling Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, there is an incredible mismatch between the American commitment and the costs of America playing the role it has traditionally played in the world, and what the American people, taxpayers, and workers feel that they're getting from that engagement. And that's why trade deals like TPP and others are so controversial, because it looks like that quid pro quo has come undone. And it's one of the things just to keep in mind as you listen to these debates within both parties. It's not even between parties. I mean, anybody who wants to talk about Democrats and Republicans anymore, it doesn't make any sense. If you look at the debates inside the Democratic Party and the debates inside the Republican Party, that's where the action is, and it's fascinating. And some of them are exactly the same debates about what should the face of American power and American engagement with the rest of the world be, both happening inside both parties. What is the quid pro quo for American workers? How should trade work? How should winners and losers be sorted out? That is one of the big debates, both in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party. So it's something to keep in mind. But part of as I said, America's commitment to other nations growing and becoming big, Brazil, India, China, which we've invested huge amounts in trying to get China to play by the rules of the West, that's not turning out to be so good. That part of the weight and the responsible management of global systems was supposed to be carried by others, not all by us. But the fact is that other rising powers are sputtering. They're not rising enough. They're rising badly. They're sort of, fine. Like if you go to Brazil, Brazil is a mess. You go to India, India is always on the edge of change, but that's the problem, always on the edge. You have other large stakeholders in the international system that are not necessarily coming on board. And now in China, and I'm sure many of you have focused on seeing what has happened within not only the Chinese markets, but what has happened is China is a big, giant, probably the world's biggest ever economic bubble. Now we're a little bit vulnerable, but there are limits to it. But inside China, what's about to happen there could be staggeringly important, because China has helped 300 million people rise out of poverty. But that story and how it was done, the economic equation is beginning to come apart. And right now, and one of the things that I track, and it's a weird thing we don't have to get into, is private sector debt. So when you look at private sector debt, it's the biggest indicator of an economy going under if that debt rises much faster than the basic fundamentals of the economy. And just in the last quarter alone, China trying to bail itself out, you've seen an expansion of debt of $800 billion in one quarter in 3 months. So everything that got them into the mess that they're in now, they're doubling down and actually creating a much, much bigger debt hole. I'm looking at my friend from Wells Fargo who probably understands what a hard thing that can be, because ultimately that kind of debt-driven expansion, or just trying to sort of flounder, is something that can come undone. And we're seeing it come undone, where trust by the Chinese in their own markets is plummeting. And instead of capital rushing into China, right now capital is rushing out of China. The implications of that are staggering and important, and we haven't quite figured them out. So rising powers are sputtering, not rising as well, and this creates a real challenge. Then you've got Russia. You've got, well, I should mention with China, that hasn't stopped them in terms of their military aspirations or their sovereignty aspirations, trying to basically take over most of the South China Sea. Some of you may know in Chinese passports, the passports actually show the South China Sea in Chinese territory. It's something that was, deeply offensive to all these other nations that kind of looked at the South China Sea as their gig. We now see China basically building one island, or building out one island in the South China Sea, landing flights there, and planning to do others as well. And so we're going to have some real tension points with China down the road. Russia is pining for the past. You have Vladimir Putin sort of positioning himself as the Ronald Reagan of the day. I know those of you that love Reagan maybe hate that analogy, but it's morning in Moscow, and that's what he's trying to sell. And that despite, $30 barrel oil and, demographic collapse, where, the average age of particularly men is just plummeting and going off the roof, alcoholism going up, child mortality surging. Russia is a real mess. But everything you see Russia doing, whether it's in Ukraine or Syria, is about a theatrical muscularity. And that theatrical muscularity, nonetheless, has consequences. And I think that what Russia is doing in Syria was one of the biggest conversation points in my time with Biden on the plane and with other leaders. And I'm happy to get into that in greater detail if some of you folks want to talk about it. But Russia is again, a global stakeholder. It just worked with us on the Iran deal. And so there are points of tension and there are points of convergence and cooperation. But it's important that we know that Russia is not necessarily acquiescing to whatever America's design is from its perspective. Europe, the biggest topic in Davos, really, besides the global inequality in wealth, which continues to be a topic every year as the rich get richer, particularly in Davos. The Davos rich get richer. And the Davos poor. I tell you, I had a $70 bad hamburger in Davos. It was really poor, but it was $70. It was not, so I was not part of that rich Davos crowd. But the other topic is whether Europe is going to survive. It's very hard for us to imagine what that means, because we think, of course it's going to survive. But central stakeholders in Europe today, faced with the economic black hole they're in, faced with the refugee crisis, faced with the fact that they're beginning to consider dismantling what they call the Schengen Agreement that allows travel within the system, that if they were to undo that, they dismantle what Europe has come to mean in the minds of Europeans. And that is a very staggering thing. And you saw, I bet, one of the leaders I failed to put on this was the Prime Minister of Greece, whom we met in Davos. And so thinking about Greece and its economic future, and why Greece is important is because Greece reflects the economy or what the future economies are of a lot of other European nations. And when you compare kind of a German confidence about itself versus European doubt about the ability to play by the same rules, you have the potential for a two-speed economic Europe, a Europe that's supercharged and a Europe of losers. And that's the way they will be presented and thought about by others. That is creating enormous tension. And so I saw for the first time more discussion about the potential disintegration of Europe. George Soros put out a note just a few days ago saying he predicts this. And others, and I can tell you, I can't quote them, but let me just say senior cabinet officials in the Obama administration who are important are pondering the same thing at high levels. So this is not an insignificant concern, and it just raises another dimension of complexity. And so when you have a Europe that's on the edge and feels it on the edge, when it comes to even things like ISIS, even after the Paris attacks, even after what you've seen in places like Spain and Germany, the plots that have been hatched in Brussels that you've seen, It doesn't mean that Europe can organize itself around a healthy, collaborative effort on all these, because they're feeling distracted by other tensions, both economic and refugee-wise. So that problem there is an enormous one among our closest allies and friends. You've got failing states. Look at Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, which I think is just continually failing despite, the best efforts of other people there. Iraq, I think, is still failing. Yemen, and that's before you get to the failing continent of Africa. A whole continent, basically, is failing. And so when you look at that, and you look at what that means, you look at the questions that we often flout about in the press about terrorist safe havens, and the fact that, as I believe, that driving a lot of our terrorist chase, the whack-a-mole problem of terrorism today is we think we've got to deal with it in Syria, we think we've got to deal with it in Libya, you've got to run to Iraq, you have to do it different places, that fundamentally underneath that is a Sunni-Shia civil war. Fundamentally a civil war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's not a civil war, but a proxy war between them throughout the region. And until you somehow deal with that, which we're not dealing with very well, you're fighting manifestations of a problem. We could go in and solve Syria, it will pop up in Libya. You can go fix it in Libya, and I'd say, Morocco right now looks stable, look at Morocco. You can go and imagine, for those of you who have been to Jordan and looked at Jordan, Jordan is a powder keg. It's a powder keg in terms of the number of refugees it has absorbed, and it's a powder keg with when you look at the inflow of foreign fighters and other people that have been able to move beyond boundaries, Jordan is a potential powder keg. So if that will then again call for a new cycle, where is France? Where is the United States? Where are the resources to go and help the others? So we're fighting manifestations that pop up here and there. It's like a burning fire under a peat moss or peat bog, where it can pop up in different places until we begin dealing with some of the fundamental issues. And the Iran deal that we just negotiated with Iran, and I am in favor of that deal, and I can talk about why, nonetheless has aggravated and extended Saudi paranoia and Sunni paranoia that every action in the Middle East has essentially looked like gifts to Iran at the cost of Sunni states. And there's some logic to that. It's not entirely crazy, but it means that when you've been trying to change the world global gravity works and trying to keep a nation from going down a nuclear track, at least in the near term, it looks as if you're creating a new embrace and set of expectations. And when I told John, I just happened to, how do I say this? I had a meeting with John Kerry recently. I won't quote the meeting, but I did share with him, and I made the comment, which I said publicly on MSNBC, that John Kerry called the Saudis and tried to prevent the execution of a senior Shia cleric, Nimr al-Nimr. You may have heard about that recently. And the execution of that man on the first day of January, along with 46 other prisoners, created massive protests throughout the Shia-Sunni world by Shia. He failed to get the Saudis, who are among our closest partners on many, many affairs, to not execute that person. When we had Navy people detained for whatever reason, floating over a line, he called Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, and said, we need to make this a good story. We need to get this solved right away. And the Iranians clipped in, and then as we now know, there were also negotiations going on to get Jared Rezaian and other Americans that were being held by Iran released in a prisoner swap, and that went on. So I said, it seems to me that Iran all of a sudden looks like the more comfortable country for you, and Saudi looks like the more uncomfortable country. Now, that's just in a short time zone, short time clip, and of course, Iran is still doing many, many nefarious things around the world, but at least in some of the things that have mattered to us, Saudi Arabia is making, according to our diplomacy, bad decisions, and Iran has begun to make some good decisions. And that's just something to keep in mind about what a weird world we're in at the moment. We have, I'm not going to hit every topic. I know one of you can say, you didn't mention climate. I will, I know my friends in climate down here. But Afghanistan and Iraq, there was an article recently called them Graveyards of Glory, are just messes. When you look at Iraq today, and I've spent some time with some of the Sunni tribal leaders that are from the Anbar region, from around Fallujah, and you look at how do you put a country together that seems so intent on ripping itself apart? It's very, very hard. You have the Kurdistan, many of you know. You've got the Sunni area in which Ramadi was just taken back. I asked, and it was part of the Vice President's pool report, I asked Prime Minister Abadi, what was he doing or how the process was going of trying to reach out to senior Sunnis in Iraq and whether it was going well, and his response was, well, we just liberated Ramadi. That's good. And from those of you, that's a very cynical answer, really, because it really doesn't say enough about the feelings of lack of political inclusion by a big sector of the Iraqi state that doesn't trust Baghdad. And you have some combination. It's one of the most interesting things that I participated in this last week were the discussions about how Turkey, which now has a base, it has a training base in northern Iraq that Abadi hates. They're kind of working in an unusual relationship with the Peshmerga, which is the only good relationship that Turkey seems to have with Kurds, but training them in a way to help retake Mosul. Abadi has threatened them that if they don't leave and they don't move these forces out, that they're going to invite the Russians into northern Iraq. I mean, it's crazy. It's just crazy. For those of you, I mean, I'm looking at a great Soviet scholar. It's crazy, right, to imagine that circumstance and what it means. And then you have down in the south efforts to try and find some Sunnis to come over to be more responsible for their own security and retaking back these cities. But the problem is the most enthusiastic who want to help are the Shiite militias, who also have vendettas and grudges to settle as they take back territory from this. And you have essentially a problem where while the governments in Kuwait and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia say on one level that they're opposed to ISIS, they will ally against ISIS, their elites, their sheikhs, and the real private money and a lot of the covert money continues to flow into the hands of al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, and I would also should say into ISIS advocates. And so that money and some of those resources go into ISIS, and so do their aspirations, that they look at a world in which they see a lot of their interests crumbling, no one standing up for Sunni interests, and they look at ISIS as something that as long as it's not in their country, they're willing to fund and support and aspirationally applaud, because they look at that as a group that is helping their interests. And when you then look at it from a US perspective, why can't we just go in and solve it? You realize that you're putting the United States and US soldiers in the middle of a very nasty religious war, and a religious war for power. And I remember interviewing George Mitchell, who was one of our peace envoys for the Middle East, but he has negotiated, I don't know baseball either, but I guess he was somehow involved in baseball. Was it baseball or basketball? You guys, some of you know that. Anyway, he's a big peacemaker. He'd failed on Israel-Palestine, but I did talk to him, along with some others, about how he saw the Middle East, and he said, the problem is so severe and so deep, and we don't want to define it as it is, that it eventually has to burn out. It will take 400 years, and they ought to call us when it's over. That was his line. Now, I don't completely agree with George, but it's an interesting perspective because it is important that the U.S., while being bold where it can make a difference, needs to be humble about throwing itself into situations where there is no exit. And it's one of the reasons why I admire Joe Biden a lot, and I admire a lot of the administration. I admire some of their Republican critics as well. John McCain, Lindsey Graham, others have been trying to think about how to deal with this Rubik's Cube of a problem in Syria and Iraq. And part of it means you've got to seduce other players to play along. You have to figure out some way to get people there. And I saw Joe Biden doing a brilliant job of this with regards to Turkey, which holds so many of the cards. And Turkey has largely been sitting on the sidelines. And it made the calculation that it hated the Kurds much more than it hated ISIS. And thus it just wasn't cooperating with us. And it did it pretending, saying, well, we're not going to really help you unless you promise a no-fly zone, which is not just a no-fly zone, over Syria. That was a way for them just to say, we really don't care about it, it's your problem. We're going to bomb the Kurds, and ISIS, you guys all take care of ISIS. ISIS is not an issue for them. Until ISIS blew up a bunch of tourists just a few weeks ago. In fact, we visited the site, the obelisks right in front of the Blue Mosque where they were killed, and the Bidens left flowers and whatnot in tribute and honoring those victims. But in the process, you saw Turkey has now snapped into place of being much more interested in trying to get some of the equation right. And when you're in the middle, as I was not in the substantive meetings, but you talk to the people that are in the substantive meetings, what's in the fascinating thing, and actually gives me a little bit of hope, is you really do see deals getting cooked up. Now, these deals have nothing to do with morality, they have nothing to do with what is right, they have to do with different competing visions of who's a terrorist and who's not a terrorist. trying to get in the same page, trying to get the Russians, the Turks just blew a Russian fighter out of the sky. We all applaud and said, well, they were right to do that. I didn't. I said it's one of the dumbest things that Turkey could have done because it actually makes everything harder. And it has probably moved the Russians more to a potential war footing with Turkey. So they're amassing troops that are not pointed at Syria, but pointed at Turkey. Turkey is building basically defenses along the Syria that have nothing to do with ISIS or the Kurds, but have something to do with preparing for Russia. So when you look at civil wars, proxy wars, all mixed up in the same territory, and people wonder, wow, why doesn't President Obama come up with a silver bullet to fix all this? You realize maybe the guy needs a little bit of a break. Now, I criticize him all the time, but Syria is an incredible, one of the greatest ulcers in the world. That's going to be an ulcer for a long time. Let's talk about, just for a minute, and I want to get to questions soon. What time do we have? Is it 1 o'clock? Oh, we're good, okay. Is what's happening also around the world in our politics, but when you look at Europe and you look at a massive refugee crisis where essentially more than a third, probably between a third and a half of the Syrian population is either internally displaced or externally displaced. That is an unbelievable number. That's a complete uprooting of a society. Upwards of 350,000 people killed, murdered, executed, and destroyed inside Syria. But then you have a surging expansion where now Europe has just committed to give Turkey $3 billion to help it with its refugee problem, to try to keep more of those refugees there. It's Turkey's card, because basically if it moves those refugees out, they're going to Europe. And you see an evolution of politics inside Europe right now, which looks eerily similar to pre-World War II politics, where the pressures of migration, the pressures of economics, the pressures of the other are coming in, and you're seeing a nativist, xenophobic view to try to keep out of it. So in Sweden, in France with Marine Le Pen's National Front, in Hungary and Austria and others, you're seeing the evolution of parties, and you're seeing Angela Merkel, who's probably been the hero on refugees, and you've seen the recent violence of some of the refugees inside Germany commit crimes and assault other Germans, particularly women. Then you have that coming undone too, and she has confided to some of our government officials that her political foundations are being shaken, and she's now in electoral jeopardy, which is very, very interesting to hear from someone as strong and as bold as Angela Merkel. So it is shaking Europe to its foundation, and that is producing some political currents which are going to run against accommodation of these refugees, and it's going to create conditions that I think are going to be uncomfortable for democracies. They're going to be uncomfortable for societies that view themselves as open societies. And I think that goes to the United States. In the United States, wherever you are on immigration issues, wherever you are on pathways to citizenship, non-pathways to citizenship, walls with Mexico, wherever you are in that debate, there's just no doubt that the U.S. as well, both for economic reasons, but also because the politics over there is similar to concerns here. When you look at what happened in San Bernardino, and I was in Los Angeles when that attack happened, and you see the way in which somebody came, it sets alarm bells off, because Al-Qaeda, my colleague at New American Foundation, Peter Bergen, interviewed Osama bin Laden in 1997 when the CIA couldn't find him. And bin Laden told him everything, told him what he was going to do, told him his theory of terrorism, told him what he was trying to do and bankrupt the United States by pinpricking us and some, but Al-Qaeda had standards. Al-Qaeda had a view that it would not mess with just ordinary targets. It was going to go after trophy things, big profile, high profile targets. ISIS inspires the most crass, crude. It is the worst kind of opponent, because it is fine with killing anyone, anywhere, in any condition. And if you go to San Bernardino and look, there's no difference there between Salina, Kansas, Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Everyone began to worry about their local mall, their kids. That used to not be the case. Now, we had people hyping the fear side in the United States before, saying you needed to worry about that, but it actually wasn't true. Now it is true. There is a concern about people, homegrown terrorists growing in the United States, and it's something we thought was not possible. So that, again, is another thing on the president's desk, the next president's desk, to think about it. And there are ways in which to talk about it, and Donald Trump has said to block all Muslims coming in the country, probably unconstitutional, probably illegal in a lot of ways, probably something but it does appeal to many Americans and their sense of insecurity in the time we're at. And I'm sure that is true here in Colorado Springs. I'm sure that is a throbbing concern, because it's a throbbing concern throughout the United States right now, and it's just part of the reality of the political system we have. But those of us that are engaged with international affairs and have prided ourselves on America being the brain drain problem for the rest of the world, of bringing the smartest and best brains here to learn and to contribute and to kind of get into the melting pot here, get some of our DNA and take it to the rest of the world. That equation is under a lot of stress right now. And so it's another big problem of how to deal with it. And I happen to have acquaintanceship with just about everybody running for president right now. I ran into Ted Cruz the other day outside the museum in Washington, D.C. I had no people around him. It was so amazing. And he knew me, and he said, "Hey, Steve," and went over and I talked to him for about 15 minutes. He's not one of my favorite people, but he was charming. He was engaging. He had seen something I'd said on MSNBC, which he pretended to agree with. And you're going to see Ted Cruz. You're going to see Ted Cruz seducing journalists. You're going to see Cruz happening, and you have something evolving in the GOP. But what's consistent with Donald Trump or Ted Cruz, I would say not Marco Rubio in the same shade, but there is a politics there which is more consistent with a disengagement from world affairs. Walter Russell Mead wrote a book called Special Providence once, in which he talked about the different attitudes and schools of American foreign policy. And one of them, which is most compelling, which I see as emerging in the Republican Party, is Jacksonian politics, which is largely worry about your own country, put walls up, but if you got to go whack somebody, go whack them hard and then pull back and get out. And that's a very different, and you see that emerging as a strong side of it. Marco Rubio is more professorial in this and wants to be somewhere of a mix of different things. He's a good guy. He's trying hard. We'll see where it goes. But that's where the Republican Party is. And in the Democratic Party, you have Hillary Clinton, which is interesting. And since I just spent time with Biden, I think one of the interesting things Democrats haven't sorted out, I'm thinking of doing an article on this, is you've got John Kerry as the transactionalist. He'll do any transaction, getting up there and kind of work. I'm not sure there's a big global vision there, but he wants to do deals. He's a deal maker. He really wants to get in and do deals. Joe Biden actually does have a strategic, you may see him full of gaffes, funny, may not think there's much there. There's a strategic mindset which is quite fascinating, and he couples it to a real investment to try and understand what the incentives of a leader are, and to getting into the head of that leader, no matter where that leader is, and trying to understand where that person is. He probably spends more on the psychological dimensions of foreign policy than any other state actor I've seen in diplomacy in a long time. Hillary Clinton, impressive, did a lot of things. It's going to be interesting, because I'm going to have to basically write my big foreign policy critique of her someday, and what I will say is impressive in many ways. That's a line, in many ways, which is kind of a way to say, question mark. But I will say, her biggest contributions were in areas that we don't think of as hardcore foreign policy. Probably digital diplomacy. She was the queen of digital diplomacy that really changed the digital dimensions of connecting with people and populations around the world. And she elevated, though I don't think she consolidated it, the questions about women, about poverty, about development, about water, about all of the climate change, about non-traditional foreign policy issues that ought to be in the room when big decisions are being made. But it's still looked at as the weak side of foreign policy. She failed to kind of elevate it to that next rung of these are vital strategic questions and concerns that need bigger treatment and need not to be looked at as unserious. And then you have other bigger strategic issues. She's prided herself on being part of the go get bin Laden, cabal, and being, tough on certain choices on Afghanistan and Iraq, what to do on Syria, that she was aligned with David Petraeus about doing a much more bold interjection of troops and not troops, but of guns and support for various of the forces inside Syria. So the concern is, when you think about strategy and you think about how chaotic the world is, my concern with Hillary Clinton, and she represents a different corner of the Democratic establishment, is, you typically call it hawkish, but that doesn't really treat with the respect where she's at, that nonetheless a much more aggressive interventionist posture And this has been one of the interesting things to take the fourth poll, which is Obama, is that interventions have costs and consequences. You can intervene in Libya, as Hillary Clinton wanted us to do, and then you can leave a country that all of a sudden has no head, no structure, and is being taken over by marauding militias, where ISIS is now invested in Sirte, and it's a completely new Syria in the making, with everyone on the sidelines, with allies like France that never came through and delivered what they promised that they would do. And that is Syria. And the fact is, America doesn't like strong men, and we don't like to see people terrorized, and we jump and say, let's go fix that. But the staying power is not there. And the appetite that America has broadly for long-term trillion-dollar investments in reshaping other economies, one, they haven't gone that well when we have made that decision, but two, that's largely what is required when you go and whack and decapitate the leadership of another country, even if it's a horrible, horrible leadership. And I think that's one of the other problems. So Hillary Clinton has traditionally been in that mode of just go and intervene. Obama's been on the side. There's a great, for those of you that follow presidential stuff, the Politico magazine just did a whole magazine on the Obama presidency. And there's an article today by Glenn Thrush, also about Obama, who kind of gives Hillary short of an endorsement, but a lot of love. And it just came out today. And I think it's fair because Biden came out and gave Bernie Sanders a lot of love recently, and said Bernie's the guy, and who's not new to the economic debate. And Obama said that being president of the United States is the most extreme walk and chew gum at the same time job in the world, and basically thought that Hillary had that capacity to think and play along a lot of dimensions. But in the national security area, she's been largely on the interventionist side of things. When you think about that and what it means, and American power, my view is American power is, can you get other countries to move along and have trust that what you say you'll do, that if you move the needle, you're going to move the needle, that American power is not blowing up things or necessarily intervening, that you can end up in a situation that's much worse, and then you collapse the impressions of American power. So that's the period we've been in after the Bush administration, and I think Obama's been trying to flounder through, is trying to get the world to respect America's ability to change the international system. That's why the Iran deal was so important. That's why the Cuban normalization is so important. Not because they had their own logics, but they're also signs to the rest of the world that we're not out of the game, that you can still change basic ways of doing things. Now, whether Cuba used to be a big deal. It's a smaller deal when he finally did the normalization, but nonetheless in Latin America, it is impressive and sends a signal to Venezuela, to other players, that America made a difference. And the Iran deal has sent a signal to the Saudis, to the Israelis, to others, foes and fans of what we did with Iran, that America can still change the system. And that is something fundamentally I think most of the world wants to see, whether it agreed with the deal or not. But it's something to think about power and how to manage it. I think Obama has been concerned about deeper interventions in Syria because he sees it as a quagmire, that once you begin tossing troops in, engaging with, right now we're seeing a lot of various kinds of scary missiles, anti-tank missiles, but I worry about Stingers and surface-to-air missiles finding their way into the hands of some of the Syrian rebels. Saudi Arabia is very animated and trying to get some of those surface-to-air missiles delivered to those, and we so far have been blocking them, but I would not say as robustly as we should. And you end up, every time we've seen it, whether it was David Petraeus was running the CIA and getting small arms to the rebels in Syria, they have sieved out every time to the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria and to the ISIS affiliates. So it's a real problem. So understanding the equation of power and reinventing power is really, really important, and I think it's hard to do for any next president. Because if you look at just trying to tell the rest of the world that we're matter, we're big, and if you don't believe us, we'll come bomb you, that doesn't work. That's not powerful, right? And if you have the budget side, we have the sequester, which has been continuing despite the recent budget deal. Sequester is still the law of the land, and you have budgetary constraints on what the Pentagon can do or not. That's not smart policy in my view. It really limits the way, it very quickly tells the rest of the world that America's capacity to handle global problems is limited. And once they see limits, whether it's in the way you manage your military, or they see limits that came out of the subprime crisis with our own economy, which we're finally growing out of, but basically 7-8 years of torturous growth back after the economic crisis, told the rest of the world, you don't have to listen to America on how it runs its economy because it's as structurally corrupt as anywhere else. Now, I know that's not true, but they perceive it that way. And the first to go are allies who say, well, America's not going to count on us as much, and your enemies move their agendas. And so the whole world is vastly more fragile and vastly different than it was, say, 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Because in that time, you saw an ability where how do I put it? Most countries didn't see the limits on American power. They thought we can reinvent ourselves out of anything. Now that is not the belief that runs around the world. There's a doubt. Now the one exception, I was asked by somebody at the end of last year in one of, kind of the MSNBC year-end things to talk about good things and bad things. I couldn't think of any good things that had happened politically. Nothing good has happened in foreign affairs or maybe some of the climate stuff, depends on where you're at on that. But really the magic of the country is in what's been happening on the West Coast of the United States. It's been in technology, it's been this stuff going to the moon, it's been, rockets, it's been, genetics breakthroughs. When I was just talking to the deputy chief of staff here of the mayor, talking about investment into Colorado Springs, I bet most of it's in technology. I bet most of it's in expanding that kind of thing. That's where the excitement of the country, that may be what reinvents the country and the aspirations of the country somewhat. But on the political side, Washington is tied in a knot. And it's very, very hard when everyone is in a corner yelling more loudly whatever his or her view is, and not necessarily in that, okay, where can we do deals, come back together. Paul Ryan has done a little bit of this and got some budget deals through, but on the whole, Washington is very much tied in knots because the political incentives for collaboration and cooperation are really, really low. In this, I made a note to myself, I haven't mentioned cyber, I haven't said much about climate, I haven't said much about Malala and women's issues or water, because people always say, oh, you didn't mention those, so I've now mentioned them. But there are a lot of things going on out there that make the situation messier than you can even imagine. But I'm happy to talk about any of the stuff we did with Joe Biden, except the off-the-record things, a little bit about how I think this next year is going to shape out with the Obama administration and what it's going to try and do. But then when we have a new president come in, I think the biggest question is that I've been asked is if Ted Cruz is elected President of the United States, if Donald Trump is elected President of the United States, I actually tell people I don't think it's going to be as bad as everyone thinks. You're being led to think it is, but the powers of the way the government works is one man or one woman actually doesn't come in to get to be a dictator. They just don't. And so there's a lot of hype about this, and it's important in politics. If you guys are engaged in it, then you should sell your own hype. But the bottom line is, even if Donald Trump were able to come in, he can't undo the Goldwater-Nichols Act. He can't undo the role by which certain structures are in place. After Franklin Roosevelt, probably the most powerful president of the United States we've ever had, came in for the number of terms that he did, and he was, by my case, brilliant, but people like Forrestal and others were very worried about another president coming in who was not great, but also had that power. And so lots of things were done in government to create checks and balances. And fundamentally, that's something I think, even with the knots we're in, and we've been knots in the past in American history, it's something to realize that even if a candidate is elected, some of you may really detest Bernie Sanders. Even if a Bernie Sanders came in, he can't just completely walk away from the kind of trade deals and the openness. You'll see a realignment come in almost with regard to any person who is elected. If Hillary is elected, you'll get counterforce to her. If Ted Cruz is elected, or Marco Rubio, or Chris Christie, or Jeb Bush finally figures his way out, I don't know. Kind of doubt it, but I've learned in politics. I remember when John Kerry was running, I never thought he would get through, but somebody said, he's going to have more money in place for longer, he'll be the last person standing, and he got the nomination, and he ran. But at the time when I saw him, I said, there's just no way this guy who's going to, trying to win sail and off of Boston, he's just not making it work. But nonetheless, he got the nomination, so maybe Jeb Bush will. But when you look at that, none of them are going to be able to single-handedly drive and dictate the course of the United States. There are a lot of other players involved, so I just want to use that as an optimistic thing, no matter where you may sit within the political realm. But let's have some conversation, will we? Thank you so much.
You might like that. And the way we're going to do this is I'll repeat the question for the purpose of our friends at Pikes Peak Library District on the camera. And the only thing I'm going to say to start out with is I gave Steve a whole lot of questions to choose from, and he just did all of the above. So it's wonderful. Open the floor. First question. Sue? Excellent question. The whack-a-mole approach, is that in part, I'm going to use a little different words, is that in part exaggerated by the role of the media that also plays whack-a-mole but doesn't give us the sense of background or continuity?
It is a huge problem. Yeah, the Atlantic, I think many other publications that are well regarded, that are serious, try to make sure that the wave of whatever public event is happening doesn't dictate the editorial direction. That said, we still know what is in the headlines, and so we'll cover that base, and then we'll cover a lot of things. Right now, what may be happening with, I'm really interested in one of the most important game changers out there right now, which may sound minor. One of the biggest standoffs is between Israel and Turkey. What's happening in Gaza? It's connected to a lot. Israel's Israel is now developing natural gas reserves, and the prospect of selling those reserves to Turkey may be something you hear about in the next 3 to 4 months. Maybe it crashes and falls apart, but Turkey and Israel have not had robust relations for a long time after the Gaza standoff. That's something I think is, in the foreign policy game, hugely potentially important. It'll get no coverage at all because it doesn't really fit. Right now, I'm on TV all the time talking about ISIS, terrorism, national security problems. I have actually a group of groupies on Twitter that say, "Oh no, Steve's on TV again, it must be bad news." And they're right, because that's what they pull me out to do. But there are a lot of other issues, and I think that it's hard. Yes, you can blame the media that it ought to do more, but at the same time, when we're taking out people in bureaus from around the world, and you see the consolidation of media, you see the homogenization of media, of the larger media operations, there are forces that are driving in that direction. There is an unbelievable amount of information out there, and I think that part of it is also the stakeholder in trying to understand more. There's nothing that stops you for signing up for some of the Middle East press or the Asian press or other, to put yourself in a gusher of alternative news that might help, even out what you're not getting from the Atlantic or MSNBC or Fox or CNN. That the world is a big place. So yes, we are complicit, but we're not necessarily responsible for the conditions. It's just something that has to be sorted out. And I think people are going to have to make those demands that they don't want such filtered. They don't want to be dealt with as Skinner dogs or Skinner animals, where they throw out something and everybody rushes off to think, oh, now we have a new cause. But another dimension of it, I think, is real. Is that world leaders today know how publics think and how they operate. There's so much polling that the way, when you look at Putin's activities and look how they have synced with conditions inside Russia, then you realize that what he's doing is creating a politics of distraction. Sometimes in the United States, you have something where if we don't have warm and fuzzy outcomes in Syria, Obama is held to blame for a lot of that. He tried to say, Asia really matters, that the future of the global middle class is going to shift to the Asia-Pacific region. And if we're not deeply engaged in that, and part of that process, a lot of American jobs will be lost to the region, and we'll continue to be part of the global middle class, but we'll be less and less and less. And so his notion there is not a stupid one. And a lot of people scoffed at it, but when you look at the numbers, you look at what's happening in the world, it is, do you choose a black hole of money investment that gets you nowhere and no growth for the next 50 years or 100 years in the Middle East? Or do you choose engagement and putting some more ships in Asia to basically deal and try to manage China's rise, both confront it, but yet try to take advantage of making sure that U.S. jobs and U.S. technology and U.S. interests are engaged in that region? That's the kind of thing that I think we should be debating more, and that we're not.
There's going to be a quiz at the end.
You're absolutely right. There are areas of promise in Africa, and there are areas of real concern. What I have when we talk about the spotlight of the media, one of the most disturbing things is on the day in which we had 13 people killed in France in the Hebdo attacks, I think it was 13, it may have been 19, you had 2,000 people die in attacks with Boko Haram in Africa. I help organize a big event every year called City Lab, and we get Mike Bloomberg and 50 or 60 of the world's leading mayors. We have meetings all around the world. And we had a lot of mayors from Nigeria and other places in Africa, and you had a real sense of what was going well and what wasn't going well. I saw Kagame of Rwanda, who wants to seemingly serve for life in a complicated situation. But when you go even to the points of promise, and I think Bill Clinton used to hold up Kagame as one of the great hopes and prospects, you look at what has happened, the deterioration inside these societies and look, I hope I'm wrong, but the inability thus far of institutions inside these countries to make the strategic leap into something beyond the pits of corruption and pits of that they're just stuck in, where people just don't have confidence in those institutions. And so the best way for people to evolve in those countries is to get out of them rather than to stay in. South Africa obviously is an exception, but even there, with South Africa growing to some degree, it's also pulled in a lot of directions. So when I look at Africa, I would love it to see, and I've talked a lot with the trade unions that have developed inside West Africa. I've talked a lot with the intelligence sharing that's been going on. There are elements of institution building that are not insignificant, but on the whole, the place has not been able to see to its own, and I think there is a kind of pathetic engagement of the West in Africa's success, that we deal with it as a philanthropy or a Sunday school exercise. The ones that have invested deeply in Africa are China. I had a meeting with Bono last year, and Bono said, he's very involved with aid and philanthropy and support. Said, if you go to the refugee camps inside different places in Africa, all the tents they made in China, that the sense that Europe and the United States are really helping to change the face of what's happening there is diminishing. Now, I don't know whether that's a good thing or bad thing. All I do know is that from what I see from the institutional side, and there are people that will tell me, well, Ghana, the economy is growing, like gangbusters, or you'll look at some elements of Nigeria where they're moving, or you'll see some institutional building with, helping certain tradespeople get export support, and the internet has changed the fact we have Qualcomm basically doing a lot of tests and figuring out how do you, invest in entrepreneurship across the region. But when you add all that up, in my book, it's still insignificant and isn't moving the needle. I wish it were a different case, and I don't want to sound offhanded as I deal with Africa, but I see the continent still unable to get governance right in such a way that trust in the future and investment in those states becomes a net plus and not a net minus. I'll tell you, I am not one of these anti-corruption guys. I mean, there's tons of corruption in Africa. There's tons of corruption all over the world. But there was tons of corruption in Korea. There was tons of corruption in Japan when they were developing. Anybody live in Japan in the 50s or 60s or 70s? Anybody serve there? Yeah, you did. So, one of the interesting stories we don't like to talk about, and I had a fight with the economist about, how did Japan get prices right? How did it succeed to the degree it did? Remaining, it's stagnant, but it had an incredible collusion between different players. The problem, or the benefit was that as corrupt as Japan was, between the businesses and the government and other players, is that if you had high walls to capital flight. So you could have investment go in, or you could have economic activity, and it was very hard for those that succeeded in Japan or benefiting at that time during their development phase to essentially run that money out. And Korea, exactly the same thing. When you look at these fast-growing economies back then, there were high walls to capital flight. I think much to our own detriment and to other countries' detriment, and particularly during the Clinton administration, we became obsessed with removing all these capital falls and thought that the frictionless flow of currency investment around the world was fantastic, and that would level the playing field and help promote investment in other countries. But we've seen in countries like Malaysia and others that didn't necessarily hold. The problem in Africa is, as you put money in, you see money running out. If you had walls to capital flight in Africa, any of these African countries, no matter where they were, and they were able, despite the corrupt circumstances, to essentially get a core of investment that would stick in the country, I think you would see education improve, I think you would see jobs improve, I think you would see greater stakeholders in the society, even though they would have to coexist with the corruption that is there today. And I think until you begin to see some dynamic like that happen, I'm not optimistic about the overall growth and development of the African continent. And there will be some cases like Ghana, maybe Tanzania, and others that somehow are standouts. But right now, you have got another brewing war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which we're not talking about in the press either. But you've got things that continually to undo progress that I see as a problem. So my apologies for giving it short shrift. I think about it a lot, and I wish it were a different story.
We only have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to take you back to one issue that you said you were going to talk about, and you mentioned.
I didn't.
But you only have 2 minutes. Climate change.
Oh.
Are we? The question is, are people becoming more serious about it, or is it just talk?
More serious in places. Look, my theory of America getting back into place as recognized as a shaper of the international system in good ways is essentially doing deals with other countries and creating a new social contract with other big stakeholders. That means China, that may mean Iran, that may mean India, Brazil, and others. And there are some big problems out there that continue to be out. So WMDs or climate change is widely perceived problem, but it's very, very hard to bring nations together to agree because they have such vested interests in not coming along. What's happened is that Chinese mismanagement of its environmental assets has created such a dynamic inside China. China's not being nice to us to be nice to us. China has to show its people, for whatever reason, even in a totalitarian country, it's not quite as totalitarian as think, that they have to do this. So you have this moment where in the COP21 talks, the Paris climate change talks, where they've come together to try to come around and create circumstances that would limit the change in temperature to 2 degrees. Everyone I know says it's not nearly enough. You may disagree, as I was talking to my friends in the climate area, but everyone I know says that what was achieved was not nearly enough, that there are lots of loopholes in it. But nonetheless, I think the process, it's part of the good story, part of the process of creating a cohesive moment and getting it. But when we had that going on, you had candidates asked about whether climate change mattered more than ISIS, right? So you had that asked. And anyone that talked about climate change, like Bernie Sanders, were immediately scoffed and saying that he was saying that is truly historic, truly important, has more impact on people around the world than anything ISIS is doing. So when you look at that in a way, we don't have the wherewithal to actually have that debate because we're drawn to the violence and horror and terror that ISIS is. And you know, I was involved with my boss in trying to get some of the journalists that had been kidnapped by ISIS and al-Nusra freed. We did succeed with one, Theo Padnos. James Foley was an acquaintance of mine who was executed and killed, the first person who was decapitated. When you get in, it's very hard to walk away from that and say, oh, climate change is a more important issue. But when you look at that and you try and weigh it, it's not getting serious treatment to the degree. But there is no doubt that when you begin looking at the scale of what could happen down the road, how enormous that challenge is, that to get any of these countries to sort of circle around it and do it. But in our politics, inside each of these countries, the violence and terror trumps those constructive adjustments and constructive collaborations in the minds of people. But in leaders, you see leaders investing in more of those collaborations on the things where they can do it. That's sort of a good story, but not a great story.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking